Well, hello again. In this week's lesson, Paul speaks on the wrath of God, and he has been doing different segments on that as he's been going along. And we're going to talk about wrath, but wrath on a different scale. Wrath is defined as intense anger on an epic scale. Wrath would be anger on steroids. So for the history lesson today, let's touch on a few of the Roman leaders and their wrath. As I stated in some of our previous lessons, Romulus was the first leader of Rome. We know that in his wrath, he killed his brother Remus so as to not mess with his reign. Somebody else that we talk about when we think of Rome is Julius Caesar. His name is synonymous with Rome. He is remembered as being the leader and dictator of Rome during its most prosperous reign in the Roman Empire. It's impossible to say exactly the death toll from the period of Julius Caesar, but it was tremendous, and I'm going to explain that a little bit. In his lifetime, Caesar was kidnapped and held for ransom. Of course, was able to be freed. Long story. It's a great story if you want to read it. But in his anger, he had the pirates that had kidnapped him and ransomed him, he had them rounded up and executed. They figure somewhere between 50 and 200 of them. At one point in his life, Caesar served as overseer in Spain. And during that time, he conquered 2 different tribes. And in conquering, he killed between 1,000 and 10,000 people. Caesar served as proconsul after his term as consul, and he conquered, and the conqueror of Gaul. At that point in his life, a total of 1 million people were killed. 750,000 Celtic people and 250,000 Germans is the estimate. At this point, Caesar fought in a civil war with Pompey and the Senate. And in the Battle of Alarda, they say that 200 people were killed. Caesar was in many battles. In the Battle of Dyrrhachium, 2,000 people were killed. In the Battle of Persalis, over 10,000 people killed. In Caesar's Egyptian campaigns, there were 20,000 people killed. At the Battle of Zela, 15,000. At the Battle of Thapsus, roughly 10,000 people killed. In his last battle, the Battle of Munda, they figure approximately 30,000 people killed. So in total, we get a rough estimate without accurate records, but it's approximately 1,940,100 people were killed during Caesar's reign. That's a lot of people. If we move ahead in time to Augustus, now Augustus was a Roman statesman and a military leader who became the first emperor of Rome once it actually became an empire. I said empire earlier, and he reigned from 27 BC until his death in AD 14. Now, Augustus was the great nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar. He became emperor as a result of a settlement between himself and the Roman Senate. Now, the Roman Empire has had an emperor up until the death of Constantine during the fall of Constantinople in 1453, when the remaining territories at that point were captured by the Ottomans and the Ottoman Empire. Great reading if you're a history buff to read that. As I said before, we're going to go back to the rulers. Now, there were many rulers in Rome who have been known basically for their wrath. And since we're talking about wrath, I want to touch on a few. Now, to set a timeline, Jesus died somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. And during this time, Tiberius was the emperor of Rome. We're talking about the writings of Paul. Paul's letters were written around 57 AD, which would have placed him under the reign of Nero. So I want to look at a few of these rulers. Let's go back to Tiberius. Tiberius followed his stepfather into power and ruled from AD 17 to AD 37. Now, Tiberius was a gifted military commander, and he was so highly suspicious of everybody, it basically controlled his life. He was suspicious of everybody, including his own family, and he was crippled by paranoia. He would get angry to the point of wrath. And if you disagreed with him, or you even just displeased him anyway, he would have you taken up and thrown off of a cliff. If we move ahead to Caligula, now he succeeded Tiberius in power, and roughly AD 37. Now Caligula also developed paranoia, and he began to act erratically. At one point, he asked the Romans to make sacrifices to him because he was considering himself a living god. In his wrath, Caligula took great delight in humiliating people. That was his thing. He liked to humiliate the Roman elite and the Senate. He mocked their value and their positions in society. At one point in his life, he actually appointed his horse as consul. Now, consul was a very coveted post in the Roman Senate. And as an insult to these men, he appointed his horse in that position. Caligula liked to kill innocent people just for the fun. He was a psychopath in a way that he loved to kill people. He would order that criminals would be given a dreadful, painful death. In fact, in his orders, he wanted them to feel the pain of death. He would throw criminals in front of hungry lions and tigers. And if there were no criminals to deal with, he threw innocent people in there just for the fun of it. That's pretty bad when you think of your wrath. We moved ahead to Nero. The thing about Nero was when Nero took power in 54 AD, he was actually a child. And his reign was bloodthirsty from the beginning. He, along with his mother, assassinated his half-brother Britannicus in order to eliminate any threat that it might pose to Nero's power being on the throne. He was, without a doubt, considered bloodthirsty in his wrath. He later killed, in his life, he killed his wife Octavia because he wanted to marry another woman. And after he married her, he ended up killing her also. That's how he got rid of his problems, or got rid of why he just killed him. Nero even killed his own mother, despite all the help she did and everything to keep him in office in the beginning. Very bloodthirsty man when he would get angry. Domitian came into power in AD 81, and it is said that his father and his brother and his predecessor Titus did everything that they could to keep him out of public office. He was deemed too ambitious and too immature. Domitian's cruelty was to the extreme when he would get angry. And many people fell under his commendation. They suffered, greatly. He would have people banished for no reason, and it was something far, that banishment wasn't good enough. He would just have them killed. Like Caligula and Nero, Domitian considered himself a god also. He put himself in godlike status. Some historians say that Domitian claimed the title of Domus est Deus, which stands for Lord and God. That's just how well how much he thought that where he was. We go back to wrath. The wrath of many leaders were carried out in different ways, and crueler than anything we can think of today. If you study history, look, we've had capital punishment in our country for a while, everything from hanging to firing squads to whatever. But the cruelty in here is thinking something we could never imagine. One way you might have been killed, if you had made somebody angry, is they would place you in an ox skin sack. Now, within this sack, they would put a snake, most likely a viper of some kind, a dog, a monkey, a cockerel. Now, a cockerel is actually a very large rooster. So, and just to kind of give you a perspective, if you grew up in the Midwest and you're a kid on the farm, there's nothing scarier than a large rooster, turkey, or goose chasing you around. So they would put all this stuff in a sack and they would tie it up. And then they would throw you into deep water. Now, psychologically, can you imagine what it would have been like to have been confined in such a small space with all those panicking animals biting you, scratching you, and all the while you're getting ready to drown, and they are also. Some people would literally be thrown into an arena with dangerous animals, wild animals. You've seen this in books and TV. It could be big cats, lions, and tigers. In some instances, it was bears. In some instances, it was actually bulls, raging, angry bulls that would do this. They might actually tie you up and tie you to the tail of a horse and then have the horse drag you to death. I've seen that in, not necessarily tied to the horse, but with ropes in Western movies. Another favorite execution style was to be burned alive. Some Roman emperors took joy in watching people be burnt alive. The thing about all these deaths is they were more for sport than they were at sport and entertainment than they were for punishment. Often people would place bets on either the person or the animal as if they were betting on a team. We kind of do that some places today. There's people who go to rodeos and root for the bulls. You know, they want the bulls to throw the cowboys. It was a sport type entertainment. Perhaps the most shameful way to be executed was to be crucified. Now, we know about crucifixion with the death of Jesus, but since this is a history lesson, let's talk a little bit about what crucifixion really was. Crucifixion was carried out in several different ways on many different shaped crosses. Generally, the prisoners were stripped naked and then either bound or nailed by their wrists to cross beams of wooden crosses. Sometimes the crosses were shaped like the small letter T, sometimes like the capital letter T, some like the capital letter X, some like a plus sign. Some of the crosses weren't even cross-shaped. There were just a single upright stake or a post. Now, sometimes these stakes would have pointed tops, and people would be impaled on these poles. Sometimes they were just tied. It was the simplest form of crucifixion and used for capital punishment. A single pole, like a telephone pole, the victim's hands and feet were bound or nailed to that pole, sometimes using just one nail through both wrists as they were held together like this, and then one nail through both ankles. They would put a wooden plank below the feet, kind of like a footrest. And what this did was it meant that the whole body weight of the person was supported only by their arms, and which would cause very excruciating pain. It would often lead to their shoulders and their elbows and their other joints dislocating. They would be unable to breathe properly. Most often, at some point, if they weren't dying fast enough, the victim's legs would be broken to hurry up death by asphyxiation. In some cases, it could take several days for a condemned person to die on a cross, with the whole point being that it was a spectacle. It was to serve as a warning by being so public that prolonged, painful, and humiliating death. It was for others to see. After the death, the corpses were always left on the cross, most often left on the cross, to be picked clean by birds. It would ensure that the unfortunate victim did not receive an honorable burial. At times, people were crucified upside down. Now, it's claimed that at his own request, Peter was crucified head down toward the ground because he did not feel worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus Christ. In the 300 years from the crucifixion of Christ to the conversion of Emperor Constantine, this violence was very common. This type of wrath was very common, which promotes the question, were they really that cruel? It is claimed that Caesar wrote something along this line. It says, "The victor is allowed to do whatever he likes to the defeated," which kind of gives you an idea on how they generally thought. So to close this lesson, I want to say, now we're talking about God's wrath. I'm not trying to compare the evil things done by these leaders to the wrath of God. There are dozens of references to God's wrath in the New Testament, including in Romans 1:18, which Paul wrote about, that says the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now, Jesus and his disciples proclaimed the kingdom of God and expressed God's love for humanity, but at no time did they ever dismiss the wrath of God. The wrath that could come to all who were disobedient to the gospel message. God's wrath is not getting revenge on humans who have offended him. That's what the Roman leaders did. Instead, I believe Paul is talking about the wrath and the judgment of God that will come to those who have rejected the truth and follow evil. And he talked about this Sunday. Wrath is never the experience of those who are responsive to God's call. Wrath is the final judgment against all who are accounted as God's enemies, those who have turned their faces from God. I do hope you've enjoyed today's lesson. I'm sorry it's a little longer. This is a very interesting topic if you want to study and look into this. Next week we will be doing something a little different for the next couple of weeks, and then we'll be getting back into our history lesson. So until I see you again, bye.